a sandstone wheel the size of a cartwheel, spinning at speed centimetres from a man's hands, loaded with water, steel dust and silica. This was the tool that finished the blades the world trusted. Before precision grinding machines standardized this work, it depended entirely on a man leaning over a spinning stone, reading the metal with his hands, in a workshop thick with dust he could not see and could not survive breathing. In the river valleys of the Bergisches Land, a hilly industrial corridor east of the Rhine, blade making had been a way of life for centuries. The rivers supplied waterpower, the forest supplied charcoal, the local sandstone supplied the grinding wheels. By the mid-20th century, the region had become globally synonymous with blade quality. Germany produced 60% of the world's cutlery in the 1960s, and the majority came from this corridor. But behind that dominance was a craft most people never saw. What made these blades so precisely finished? And why, even as synthetic abrasives became available, did the most skilled grinders still insist on natural stone? The men who ran these benches were not factory workers in the modern sense. They were master grinders, a trade organised into guilds as early as the 15th century. The knowledge passed through apprenticeship, years spent alongside an experienced grinder before independent work began. A schleifer learned by watching and by doing, the angle of the wrist, the sound of the contact, the feel of a blade that still needed work. These were not things that could be written down in any useful way. They were absorbed through repetition over time. The craft was embodied, precise, and it began with the stone itself. The grinding wheels used in this trade were massive discs of natural sandstone, often a metre or more in diameter, weighing several hundred kilograms. Sandstone's particular value lay in its cutting action, quartz grains hard enough to remove steel efficiently, yet the stone's natural porosity prevented overheating and preserved the blade's temper. Synthetic alternatives cut faster, but ran hotter and could draw the hardness from a fine edge if pressure was misjudged for even a moment. Natural stone was not tradition for tradition's sake. It was precision, and precision was the product. Transporting a wheel of this size was a serious undertaking. Positioning it was more dangerous still. A stone of several hundred kilograms could not be handled carelessly. One internal crack, invisible from the surface, and the wheel could shatter at speed. Mounting the wheel required ropes, levers, and the coordination of several men. The stone was seated onto its iron axle and secured with lead packing. Molten lead poured into the gap between bore and shaft, absorbing vibration in a way no rigid fitting could. Once mounted, the wheel was dressed, a steel blade held against the rotating surface to true it, opening the stone's face to expose fresh abrasive grain. A wheel running fractionally out of round would transmit vibration into every blade it touched. The stone had to be true before the blade ever touched it. When the wheel came to speed and the first blade was brought to the stone, the workshop changed. Orange sparks swept away from the contact point. Water, fed in a thin stream from above, ran down the face of the stone, cooling blade and wheel, carrying fine grit away from the surface. The master grinder lay almost prone above the wheel, guiding the blade at a fixed angle, not gripped, but held. Pressure through the heel of the hand, distributed along the blade's full length. Too much, the stone glazes over. Too little, the heat builds, the temper is lost. He knew the difference by sound, long before it was visible. By the later decades of the 20th century, This form of mastery was in steady decline. Automated machines had taken over the majority of production grinding. The hand grinder's role was narrowing, reserved for finishing work, specialist blades, quality that machines could not yet replicate. The knowledge remained, but the number of men who carried it was shrinking with each generation. The health cost of this work was no secret. Sandstone grinding produced a fine silica dust that accumulated in the lungs, causing silicosis, an irreversible fibrosis with no cure. Britannica records it as one of the oldest known industrial diseases, documented specifically among knife grinders by the 18th century. Grinders in this trade knew the risk. Many worked shortened lives because of it. The difference between a competent grinder and a master was invisible at the moment of finishing. It became clear over years of use. A master ground blade carried a hollow grind, a concave bevel produced by the curve of the stone's face, thinner behind the edge, allowing flex under load rather than transmitting stress to the cutting point. Machines could approximate this geometry. They could not replicate the constant micro-adjustment of a skilled hand. A blade marked with this region's name was not simply a product. It was a legal guarantee of metallurgy, of finish, defended since the 16th century, when authorities first attempted to control the use of the regional name as a mark of origin. By the 20th century, that protection had become formal trademark law. Every blade that left a grinding shed here carried the weight of centuries, not as sentiment, as contract. Long before precision became a number on a drawing, it lived in the hands of a man lying over a spinning stone, reading a blade through his palms. The sandstone wheels were eventually displaced by synthetic abrasives and automation. That displacement was rational. The economics of scale demanded it. But what was lost was not only a technique, it was a form of judgment, the ability to read a material in motion and respond to what it tells you. Those blades are still in use, in kitchens, in workshops, in the hands of people who do not know their history. These systems shape the world quietly. If you'd like to see more of them preserved, tell us which forgotten craft should we document next.